A quick Tolkien trivia quiz. Do you know what made the cats of Queen Beruthiel so good at tracking? Do you know what it would take to battle a wild wereworm in the last desert? Do you prefer the song Leir Cubeleg or the Aldunye? If you answered any of these questions, congratulations, you're a liar. Welcome to the Geek Pantheon. I'm your host, Philip, and this is another episode of Tolkien Studies. We're going to be looking at Tolkien's embedded mysteries today. As always, these episodes are brought to us by the Geek Lyceum, a listener-created book club that spawned out of our Patreon Discord. If you want to be a part of that discussion, please feel free to check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/thegeekpantheon to look at all of our various levels of support and how you can be a part of those conversations. So when we read Lord of the Rings, and when we read really good fantasy, one of the things that tends to happen is you'll come across references that don't seem to mean anything. They don't seem to have an actual reference point. Now, fantasy that's trying to seem like this will often mention that, and then some character will ask, well, what's that? And you get a really long, lengthy explanation that you didn't really need. Sometimes that's necessary in a fantasy book. If you don't understand, if you're reading Lord of the Rings and you don't know who Isildur is, that the ring is Isildur's bane, then you miss some things, especially considering the storyline with Aragorn. But lots of other small references you don't need to know. But they still do something for the story, and we're going to talk about what they are, they do, and why Tolkien did that so frequently throughout his book. My source for a lot of the references in here and the examples of this come from Tom Shippey's excellent book, Tolkien, author of The Century. Shippey holds the job that Tolkien used to have at Oxford and has written two really excellent books exploring Tolkien's literary worlds, author of The Century and then also The Road to Middle-earth. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight involves Tolkien's literary career as to why he did this in his book, and rather than pulling together a whole bunch of different sources, Shippey talks about this in detail in his book, so I'm going to use the examples that he uses. So one of the reasons that we find all of these odd references is that these were one of the things that Tolkien both loved and was frustrated by about English mythology. When Tolkien was young, he was exposed to a lot of the new mythology and fairy tale compendiums that came out in the 19th century. During the 19th century, with the rise of nationalism, there were attempts by authors in Finland and Germany and England and all these other places to collect all of that cultures, all that nationalities' historical legends, and combine them into one place so that they would be preserved. Tolkien really admired this effort and was disappointed that there was really nothing to be done for English fairy tale, for English myth and legend. You could find Celtic folklore that had been preserved both in the Irish tradition and the Welsh tradition and the Scotch tradition, but not so much for England. And so Tolkien, who was a lover of and a student of and a professor of Old English literature, began looking at these myths, and the thing that frustrated him was that he could see evidence of something older behind. To take the most well-known Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf for an example, Beowulf is clearly being transmitted to us by a Christian. When we read in Beowulf about who the monster Grendel is, one of the things that we're told is he's of the line of Cain. But it's also true that Beowulf is obviously originally a pagan story. The story is obviously pre-Christian in a lot of the references and a lot of the language that it uses. It has to have been from a time before Scandinavia, where the story seems to have originated, was Christianized. So Tolkien is looking at the story and he wants to know, what's the story behind this? Where did this story really come from? And actually, he attempted this in a long poem called Salic Spell, which is his attempt to sort of get at the original stories that were collected into the poem Beowulf. And lots of literary historians have done this. You can do this with the Iliad of Homer. The Iliad is also clearly drawn from a whole lot of different sources rather than just invented by Homer. And lots of historians have wanted to explore what were the heroic ballads that Homer was drawing on to create this grand epic narrative. So Tolkien was always interested in this. And there were a lot of examples to be learned in Tolkien's field of philology, of the study of the historical development and literary use of language. And Tolkien, in reading these old works, he kept coming across words that he wanted to know why they were there. They were either unnecessary, or they were repetitive, or they didn't have a logical translation. And part of Tolkien's work as a philologist was to try and figure out what those words meant by looking at associated words. So an example of just something that Tolkien found on the edge of a myth. In the Elder Edda, which is a poetic collection of Old Norse myths, in the early section, which is the Song of the Seer, there's a section that's been inserted. Most historians don't think it was there originally, but it's been inserted because it seems to sort of break sentences. The poem is going along, and all of a sudden it breaks, and we go into this long list of the fathers of the dwarves. And Tolkien, reading through this list, because this is the kind of literature that he loved, Tolkien comes across a whole bunch of names. By the way, most of the names for the dwarves, or all the names for the dwarves in The Hobbit, are drawn from this list. And most of the names for all the dwarves we ever meet in Middle-earth. But embedded in the list, there's a weird one. There's one that doesn't fit. Gandalf, which means staff elf or wand elf. And Tolkien, who knew a lot about Norse folklore, knew that alf, was a different word from a dwarf, was different from a dwarf. The dwarves and the elves, Tolkien felt, were clearly distinct. And so why is there the name of this person who's clearly an elf, not a dwarf, in this list of dwarves called the Dwergetal? And so Tolkien seems to have decided that at some point there must have been a wand elf, a wizard, an elf wizard, who went around with a troop of dwarves. And this list is an echo of something that must have happened way in the past. And so when he comes to write The Hobbit, Tolkien has this long list of dwarves, but they're with someone named Gandalf, who's not an elf anymore by the time that Tolkien gets around to him, but he's certainly kind of an elvish figure in that he's knowledgeable and magical and fulfills all the roles that an elf in a traditional fairy tale might. So Tolkien sees this thing that's unexplained in a fairy tale, and he wants to know what it is. Another good example of this is one of Tolkien's words that he invents, the word warg, for the evil wolves. This comes out of, again, Tolkien's study of Old Norse, which was a language related to Anglo-Saxon that Tolkien studied extensively. Old Norse has two words for wolf. One of them is ulfr, which is where we get our word wolf, but the other is wargr. And wargr means not only wolf, but it is also used to mean outlaw. Now, an easy explanation, a simple explanation that puts this easily to rest is outlaws are kind of like wolves. They prey on the weak, they prey on the unsuspecting, they move in packs. And so this is just a metaphor. But if that's the case, Tolkien's fantastical reasoning goes, if that's the case, why not call him Ulfr? Why not use this one word that we've got for wolf? Why do we need two different words for wolves, and one of them means outlaw as well? Well, Middle-earth tells us there are wolves, but there are also outlaw wolves. there are evil wolves. This is helped along by Tolkien looking at the Anglo-Saxon words that come out of this, some of which have a meaning like shadow and things like that. And so Tolkien begins to draw all of these words that are drawn from this Old Norse word wargr to create the idea of an evil type of wolf that's maybe not really a wolf. Maybe it's a spirit in wolf form or something like that. And so again, we find this word in a fragment of Old Norse, and Tolkien runs it down to its root and works out what he believes must have been the point. Why does this word exist? Orc is another word like that. Orc derives in Middle-earth. Orc derives originally from Beowulf, where a long list of monsters. There's this word Orkneys, and Tolkien translating it. Most people translate Orkneys as demon. If you look in Beowulf, you'll find the word demon there. And that's because the word orc probably it's probably a Germanized form of the Latin orcus, which was a word for demon, a demon related to the underworld. But neas, this word that's attached to orc, means corpse. So Orkneys is a demon corpse. And that's a very evocative image that is unexplained in Beowulf. We don't know what these Orkneys are. But this word stuck in Tolkien's head. And when he comes time for Middle-earth, he decides to explore what are these Orkneys. And we get the story of the elves captured by Morgoth and twisted and tormented until they are this grotesque, bent form of what was once beautiful. In other places, we find in Old Scots, we find the word wraith. And Tolkien, looking at Old Scots, we find that Old Scots, this wraith transition, we find another place the word raid, which is just the Old Scots dialect for ride. And so if we do the same thing and we go wraith and we make the same vowel shift, we find writhe. And writhe derives from, or is the root for our words wrath and wreath. And so we have anger, twisting, writhing, all connected. And then in the Scots form, wraith, which is used about spirits. And so in Tolkien, we find twisted, angry spirits that are wraiths. So Tolkien loved this. Tolkien loved seeing these things just on the edge of fairy tale, on the edge of stories. And he wanted to know where did it come from? What was its origin? And since he couldn't find out, because unfortunately so much of Anglo-Saxon myth was lost over the course of multiple of the Norman conquests and the Christianization of England and various things like this, because all this was lost, Tolkien took these words and he built them into Middle-earth as a sort of way of recovering them and presenting his version of what they might mean. But what's really wonderful about Middle-earth is that even as Tolkien takes these words that were unexplained in myths that he loved and inserts them into his world with full explanation, he also sprinkles throughout his world things that have no explanation. Like the song that Turin sings after he accidentally kills his dear friend Beleg Cuthalion, the Lair Cu Beleg, the song of the strong bow. This song is not given to us. We have no version of it. As far as we know, no version of it exists. Or the song sung by the Valar about the destruction of the trees, the Aldunia. The song must exist in the world, and the elves know it, and the elves keep it, but Tolkien's not going to tell us. We don't get to know. Aragorn, in praising Gandalf's ability to find his way in the dark, says that he's sure of finding his way through in the dark easier than the cats of Queen Baruthiel. What? And Tolkien, in multiple letters to fans who were curious about these different things, he explained that he had drawn most of the material for Middle-earth from his previous work. Most of it already existed. But one of the exceptions he always admits is the Cats of Queen Beruthiel, which he knows nothing about. Later in life, he was asked about it. He was asked about it again in an interview, and he finally gave an answer. And he said that we knew she was a queen of Gondor, and that we knew what king she'd been married to from his appendices. But this thing with the cats, what's up with the cats, and what's special about the cats? And Tolkien gives an answer that she's one of these people who hates cats, but cats are always drawn to her, and she took to torturing them, and she used some of them as spies, and eventually she went back to her home in Umbar. This wager would never be able to be called because Tolkien's, of course, passed on. But I would wager just about anything that he made that answer up on the spot. Tolkien didn't know much about Queen Beruthiel. He knew she was a queen. He knew she was a queen of Gondor. He knew she was a black Númenórean from Umbar. But he didn't know anything about her cats. It was just something Aragorn said. And that happened with a lot of things. Tolkien was constantly surprised by the things that his characters said things about. Some of these things he further went on and explored and explained. But a lot of them he just left for us. So why? Why does Tolkien do that? Why does he leave these things in here sprinkled throughout the books, throughout his world, that we never get to hear? Why don't we get to? We've got all these songs in Middle Earth? Why not present us with Leir Cubeleg or Aldunia? Well, I'm going to talk about what that does for world building in any fantasy story, and in any kind of world building that you would do for books or games or any number of things. The main thing they do is they invite us to ask, what's that? And people did. Tolkien got enormous amounts of fan mail written to him, much of it asking, what is that? And asking him for more information about all of these things. And you got to remember that Tolkien did not live to see the Silmarillion published. And so all the references, Bilbo references how fine it is to be walking around bearing a blade from Gondolin. No one knows what Gondolin is at that point. No one knows when Elrond talks about how his lineage goes all the way back to he remembers the host of the Valar who came out of the west. He's talking about the War of Wrath, which is discussed in the Silmarillion, but not in Middle-earth, not in Lord of the Rings. We don't know what that is in Lord of the Rings. We don't know what that is when Tolkien passes away. We don't know that Glorfindel, the elf who comes to get Frodo and Aragorn and find them when they're running from the Nazgul, we don't know that Glorfindel is an elf who once lived in Gondolin and died in battle with a Balrog and has returned from the halls of Mandos. We don't know any of this. We don't even know, really, who Elbereth is. The elves are constantly singing about this lady Elbereth, and elsewhere Varda, who are of course the same person, but we don't know anything about them. We don't know about the Valar except in references. So there's all of this mystery, and Tolkien eventually intended to publish the Silmarillion, and of course Christopher Tolkien did after his father's death. And many of these things are explained in the Silmarillion, but not all of them. And so it invites us to ask, what's that? The other thing that's really great about it is that it creates essentially a reverse dramatic irony. Dramatic ironies where we know things the characters don't. And that's present in most novels, and it's present even in Lord of the Rings. But it also, now we have in Lord of the Rings this reverse of that, where the characters know things that we don't. And that's also common in novels, but this is a bit different. It's not like the murderer in the mystery that you're reading knows who done it, and maybe the detective discovers who done it before it's revealed to you, the reader, or something like that. Sure, but there are fundamental things about the world that everybody in the world seems to understand, but you don't. Why do that? Why leave you in suspense? Even with all of the back matter that Tolkien added to Lord of the Rings, even with all the appendices and everything like that, why still leave you in suspense about the host of the West, or the Aldunia, or the full story of Beren and Luthien, which we don't get in Lord of the Rings. We get references to it. It's clearly really important. Even Sam knows the story of Beren and Luthien, but you and I don't until the Silmarillion is released. What they do is they create authenticity. They create a world that has existed before you and I opened the book and continues after you and I close it. If an alien came to Earth and inquired of you about World War II, that would make sense. But if someone up on the street asks, if you're talking and you say, oh, that movie's about World War II, and someone goes, what's World War II? You'd look at them like they'd been living under a rock, unless they're, 5 or 6. These are things that everyone knows. It would be weird to write in a novel, someone say, this is the worst thing that's happened since World War II, and someone goes, what's that? Everyone knows. It's part of the knowledge of our world. And, likewise, things like the Boston Tea Party or the fall of Rome or things like this. You don't know much about Numenor in Lord of the Rings. And a foreigner to our world wouldn't know much about Rome. We say Rome wasn't built in a day. What's that? This is, all the way back in antiquity, the fall of Rome. What's that? These aren't things that that adults need to ask in our world, because they're things that we know because they're part of our culture. And so having these references in Lord of the Rings makes the world feel alive. It makes the world feel organic and lived in, and it makes us believe that these people are what they claim to be. Think about how long it is in Lord of the Rings before we really get an explanation of Isildur, after we have the reference to him. Think about how long it is before we really understand who Aragorn is. Part of that's because Tolkien didn't understand who Aragorn was when he first introduced him. But part of that's also because there are these words, there's these things that don't need explanation in a real world. And so, apparently, the cats of Queen Beruthiel are a common thing, or a common part of culture, a common reference point. And so Aragorn doesn't need to then turn and tell Sam or Pippin or Frodo who Queen Beruthiel is and what's special about her cats. You and I know a little bit about who Queen Beruthiel was if we've read a whole lot of stuff from Tolkien, but it's never really explained to us what was so great about her cats and why they were so good at finding their way home. We just don't know. Now, when we know, he tells us. But what's great is that Tolkien doesn't just dump this on us. It's not just a character thinks, oh, well, yes, the tale of Beren is all about. He tells us by having a realistically ignorant person ask. And in a lot of cases, this is the role of the hobbits. The hobbits are the most like you and I. They've lived a sheltered life from the big world of Middle-earth. And so it's reasonable that Sam doesn't know who Isildur is. It's reasonable that Sam doesn't know who Beren is until Aragorn begins singing this song of Beren and Luthien. So Tolkien has this pattern of allowing a character who has the least amount of knowledge usually do the narrating of the story, whether that's Frodo or Sam, whether that's Gimli or Pippin. Tolkien gives us the perspective most of the time of the least informed character in the room, so that when we, the audience, need to know more about the lore of this world, that person can reasonably also need to hear more about the lore of that world. Another thing that it creates for us, another thing that this does with Tolkien's world, is that it interlaces within his legendarium. And it created an excuse for Tolkien to write the thing that was really the work of his heart. As much as Tolkien was glad for the success of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the thing he had really wanted to write all along was the Silmarillion. In fact, when The Hobbit succeeded and his publisher came to him and asked for a sequel, what Tolkien sent them was several pieces of the Silmarillion. And they gave it off to their reader, and their reader came back and said, I don't know what this is. I've got this poem about Beren and Luthien, and I've got this story about the fall of Gondolin, and I've got this piece about the creation of the universe. I don't know what this is. This isn't a novel. What is it? And so they gently told Tolkien, maybe something a little more traditional, and that's how we get Lord of the Rings. But by creating all of these interlaces, by referencing Gondolin and Beren and Luthien and Turin and Glaurung and Morgoth and all of these things that we don't know anything about in Lord of the Rings, Tolkien kind of sets himself up to be able to say, when Lord of the Rings is successful and there's talk of another sequel, he's able to say, well, I have this book that explains all those things that I didn't explain in Lord of the Rings, or most of them in any case. So Tolkien kind of seeds in an excuse to write the book he really wanted to write all along. But for us as readers, it creates this web that connects the Silmarillion to the Hobbit. Even though, the tone of the Hobbit compared to the tone of the Silmarillion is wildly different. It's absurd. The Silmarillion's like reading the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire or the Bible in a lot of places, and The Hobbit is very clearly a children's fairy tale, and yet Bilbo is carrying this blade of Gondolin. Gandalf is carrying the sword of the king of Gondolin. And we have this Elrond half-elven who's just kind of a wise man in The Hobbit, but in Lord of the Rings we learn that he's the son of Eärendil. By the way, Eärendil is another one of those things that comes out of the edge of a story. There's a poem by Kinwulf, the Anglo-Saxon, which is talking about Christ. But when he talks about John the Baptist, who acts as a forerunner, a prophet in advance of Christ, he says, and I'm going to get this wrong so I didn't write it down in my notes, but Hail Eärendil, brightest of angels, sent to men here on Middle Earth. Midgard, Middle Earth. Tolkien looks at this word, Eärendil, and says, why would you call John the Baptist Eärendil? There must be some traditional story about a messenger sent because of course that's what angel means, messenger. A messenger sent from the divine powers to men as a sign of hope. And that's where we get the story of Eärendil, the mariner. And we learn that Elrond is his sire, and we learn that he has something to do with Aragorn. And Bilbo writes this really absurd poem about him that's sung in Rivendell, and which fits, by the way, to the tune of I Am the Very Model of a Modern Major General, which is just hilarious to me to imagine Bilbo chanting this Gilbert and Sullivan song in Rivendell. Right, and I think that's what Tolkien intended for us to picture is the absurd unfittingness of Hobbit poetry, and Bilbo writing Hobbit poetry about something so lofty. And it's just a wonderful example of who hobbits are. That's not the point. But Eärendil is another one of those things, and we learned that Eärendil is Elrond's father. We still don't exactly know what that means because Bilbo says Eärendil was a mariner, and he sailed to Elvenholm, but we don't know why. We don't know anything about Morgoth. We don't know anything about why Eärendil went there. Later, Galadriel tells us that the phial of Galadriel contains in it the light of Eärendil, the star, caught in the waters of her mirror. Wait. Eärendil's a star now? So this interlacing web connects The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion all together, and even further on with the things that Tolkien was working on, the unfinished tales and all that. It pulls them together to create something that really no other fantasy author has done yet. Some have come kind of close in the terms of the depth of this, but it creates something where everything Tolkien wrote, in the end, with a handful of exceptions, links back to Middle-earth. The last example of this in Tolkien I wanted to give is right behind me. It's the map. The map of Middle-earth, and especially the map in The Hobbit, is so evocative to the degree that you really don't get epic fantasy without some kind of crazy map anymore. It's necessary. It's a necessary thing. It's part of the deal. There's so much about this map that is evocative, especially, if you're talking about things before the Silmarillion's been published. This sea over my shoulder is labeled as the Sundering Sea. Why is it the Sundering Sea? What does it sunder us from? In some maps, especially in The Hobbit, north of the Lonely Mountain, you find the withered heath where the great worms bred. Worms in dragon talk, and it's spelled as dragons, right? WYRMS. What is that? And there's all these little things on the map that don't come up. They don't matter. We never learn much about places like Dorwinion or the Sea of Rune or Harandor or the Crossings of the Poros or any of these things. We learn very little about these places. And even the places we do learn something about, it's still pretty minimal. And so the map is another way that Tolkien sort of shows us that this is a real world. Here's the map of the part of the world that this story takes place in, but really the story is only going to take place in that much of it. It's going to cross the whole map, or nearly all the map, but really only going to deal with a very small percentage of the map itself. And so when we create worlds, when Tolkien creates his world, and when authors today create worlds, what they're trying to do is to convince you that the world exists, that it's not just your imagination, that the world is a real place. It feels true, it feels authentic, and the only way for that to be the case is if you feel every now and again that you're a stranger in this place, overhearing things that make perfect sense to everyone in the room except you. And that's what Tolkien gives us in Lord of the Rings, and that's what every fantasy author since Tolkien has been trying to do. All right, well, that was a bit of a shorter video today. Thank you all for watching, and I really appreciate the response that these videos have gotten so far. This, again, started as more of a request from a listener that I was obliged to follow up on due to a bet, and I've really enjoyed doing this, and I've really been pleased with the response. So thank you very much for watching. Once again, this has been a presentation of the Geek Pantheon. I'm your host, Philip, and I'll see you later.